Today's headline is What a Man Can See in 6 Weeks Without Money. The subheadline says J.W. Goodkind was stranded in New York without any money. In this predicament, he decided to start across the continent for San Francisco. What singular adventures he met with, how he fared, and what sights he saw will be found below. It says, it is possible to cross the continent from New York to San Francisco without a cent of money to start with and have a good time in the bargain. J.W. Goodkind has just proved it by actual trial. He arrived in the city a few days ago and is now stopping at a First Street hotel. He was 6 weeks on the journey and seems to be none the worse for his venture. While traveling in this Goodkind fashion has its disadvantages, it is not a speedy way and at times becomes dangerous, but on the other hand, it has its bright side. Everything depends on how the traveler regards life. While on the journey across the continent, Goodkind had some of the most enjoyable days. Without a cent in his pocket, he was whirled through beautiful valleys on the fast express trains. He rode on palace steamers and enjoyed the sights of the Great Lakes. He visited many cities. He witnessed a number of imposing ceremonies. And as a sort of a side jaunt, he visited several noted summer resorts. Many people would be inclined to look upon Goodkind's achievement as a series of hardships, and such indeed it might be, provided only the hardships were picked out. But to a man who looks at the bright side, it is a good deal of the pleasure trip about it. As Goodkind tells his story, it is plain that he suffered a little and enjoyed life for all there was in it while on the road. 6 weeks ago, I was broke in New York, he said, in narrating his experience. I had not a cent to my name, and there was no work in sight. One morning, I was compelled to go without breakfast. I killed the forenoon wandering up and down the wharves, wondering what I should do. Everything I had owned in the world had been sold. My room rent was up, and I looked forward to spending the night in the streets. I surely would have been compelled to do this if a happy thought had not struck me. Why not go to San Francisco, I said to myself. I made up my mind to set out at once, but I was hungry. However, a meal came to me through a chance meeting with a friend who invited me to dine with him. I told him that I was going west. If I had asked him for a loan, he would not have given it to me. As it was, I started off across the continent with a full stomach. I decided to make Buffalo my first objective point and to travel over the Lehigh Road. The trip was a very pleasant one. The weather was perfection, and nature looked her best. The ride over the state of Pennsylvania was simply delightful. The mountain scenery was grand, and I enjoyed every bit of it just as much as if I had paid my fare instead of beating my way on the train. The last part of my journey was made in a boxcar and was a little warm and close, but not much more so, I fancy, than a cushioned parlor car that passed me at one station on the road. Landing in Buffalo, I went into the regular washroom at the depot, just like a first-class passenger, and removed all marks of travel. This washroom was as free to me as if I had been a paying patron of the road. My clothes were fairly good, and as I surveyed myself in the glass, I saw that I presented a fairly good appearance. I then hunted a restaurant and told the proprietor I wanted a bite to eat. He told me to be seated and brought out the best he had in the place. You may be sure I filled up. Then I started to hunt a job. Work was plentiful in Buffalo and I was soon engaged by a man on the docks. I had considerable time to myself and visited all points of interest in the town. The beautiful parks, the fine public buildings, and any number of other attractions were all as free as air. But I never forgot while sightseeing that I was on my way to San Francisco, so I stayed in Buffalo only a few days, although I must say the town treated me mighty well. Cleveland was my next stopping place, and I started out with a little money in my pocket. For 50 cents, I bought a ticket on a lake propeller and started early in the evening. It was the most enjoyable moonlit night, and I lay back in a steamer chair getting the full benefit of it. Cabin passengers who paid big prices for staterooms were no better off than I, for it was too hot to live inside. About midnight, I dozed off and slept until morning. Work wasn't plentiful in Cleveland, so I put in my time taking in the sights of the town. I strolled about on the handsome streets, listened to the music in the parks, and visited all the public institutions. I stayed there only one day, and then took a steamer for Toledo. My second night on the lake was almost as pleasant as the first. I had no steamer chair, but had to stretch out on the dock. However, I slept comfortably and early in the morning reached Toledo. I got an easy job without any trouble and stayed in the town several days, finding the people hospitable and generous. I saw all there was to see and thoroughly enjoyed myself. My next stop was at Detroit, also on the lake. This stage wasn't as romantically pleasant as the others because it wasn't moonlight, but I had nothing to complain of. The Detroit people proved a sorry lot to me. Work was scarce and grub was more expensive than at the other places I had stopped at. I had to economize, but I slept in a good bed, ate plenty of fruit which was cheap, and had plenty of other things. I kept myself looking fairly well. There was not so much to see here, but such as it was, I took in and then concluded to get out. Jackson, Michigan was my next stop. On account of a constitutional shortage in cash, I was not spending any more money than I had to, so I made the journey on a freight train. There was no hardship connected with it, only a slight discomfort. The worst blow I suffered on the trip was when I arrived at Jackson and found that it didn't have any public washroom at the station, just as there had been at all the other places. You see, it was a great point with me to always look as spruce and clean as I could when I entered a city. Work and seeing sights seemed to come easier. I looked pretty battered and found out the effect when I struck a man for a job. He had no use for me. This was a lesson that had been rubbed into me enough, and after that, I always specially managed to look decent whenever I asked for work. From now on, I simply wandered as my fancy suited me. Sometimes I paid small fares and rode for short distances on the elegant trains that are constantly running through the country. Sometimes I rode in boxcars and sometimes I walked over the fine country roads. Occasionally, I got a lift from a farmer, but I always made progress toward the Pacific coast. Whenever a day's work turned up, I did it. If there was no work, I kept moving west. After working for a couple days at a farm, it was generally the custom for the people to give me a big bundle of grub in addition to my pay. It was always enough to last me several days. As the weather was pleasant, I nearly always slept outdoors under the shelter of some friendly haystack. So you see, I needed very little money. Before reaching the Mississippi River, I visited Kalamazoo, Michigan, and spent several hours in the beautiful public library there. Then I moved over into Indiana and took in all the principal towns, including Wabash, Logansport, Danville, Decatur, Bloomington, Peoria, and Burlington. In most of these cities, I was well treated and could have obtained steady work at any one of the places. But I was bound for California, the land of plenty. I was moving on westward. I crossed the Mississippi on a fine ferry boat and landed in Burlington, Iowa, in the best of shape. I was feeling fine after my 3 weeks on the road. The trip did me good physically, and I am sure I improved my mind, for I saw many strange and curious things. There was very little work to be had in Iowa, as I discovered almost as soon as I arrived. As my few dollars were growing smaller, I concluded to shake the dust of the state from my feet as soon as possible. I stuck to freight cars as much as possible, but occasionally got bounced. I managed to see what there was to see at Des Moines and Ottawa and got across the state in 3 days. Iowa is a beautiful state and a good producer of farm products, but the people are cold and work is scarce for walking gentlemen of the road. From Council Bluffs, I crossed the Missouri on a trolley car and landed in Omaha, where the big exposition was in progress. I spent a couple of days taking in the sights. The exposition alone was well worth my trip. Words cannot describe it. I saw more than I ever expect to see again and thoroughly enjoyed myself. Just as much so as if I had paid to get in and stopped at the finest hotel in town. Omaha is very hospitable. That is without any money I found it so. Almost broke, I pulled out of Omaha on a stock train. Then my troubles began. I had struck the thin edge of the western country. Food was scarce, work scarcer, and the landscape dreary. Across Nebraska, it was flat and bare, and then desolate mountains rose on all sides as I got into Wyoming. Utah was no more encouraging. By the time I crossed the Nebraska line, my money was practically all gone, and I had to go along as a bum. Water to wash with there was none, and I even went thirsty on more than one occasion. Food was hard to get because the people who might have given it to me had not enough for themselves. At night, I always slept on the ground, and occasionally I passed nights of horror when I heard the wild beasts howling around me. Frequently, I heard rattlesnakes hissing near me, and had to get up and build a fire to keep them away. Ogden was an oasis in the desert, but times are hard in the state, and I could not get work there. However, I was well fed and given a place to sleep, so that the few days I was there, I thoroughly recuperated, and with a scant layer of fat on my ribs, I pushed on west. I got a job in a hayfield near Battle Mountain for a few days. The money I earned there got me some clothes when I got to Reno, so that when I neared the California line, I was looking like a gentleman. Once more, I began to really enjoy life after those horrible weeks I had spent on the deserts of Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. At Truckee, I thought I had struck paradise. Beautiful mountains, cool streams, big trees, and hospitable people. Food was plenty, and nobody would let me go hungry. I was in God's country, sure enough. I could easily have ridden down the mountains on a freight train, but I concluded to walk and get the full benefit of the glorious views of mountain scenery. I was feeling happy again and was thoroughly enjoying life. For a very little bit of work, people gave me food and money besides. The walk through the snow sheds was thoroughly enjoyable. I had a glimpse of Donner Lake and the grandest views on all sides of me for miles and miles. Then I spent a day or so in the big orchards of the Sacramento Valley, and when I had seen all I wanted to see, moved on to San Francisco. Here I am, still enjoying myself. The Palace Hotel is a grand place and well worth traveling miles to. No, I'm not stopping there, but nobody has refused me permission to see the beauties of its magnificent court and splendid halls. But there are so many things to see in San Francisco, all without money and without price, that I'm glad to be here. This is the best place that I've struck, and a fitting wind-up to my pleasure trip across the continent, which I made without a cent to start out with. This story comes from the great state of California, being reported in the San Francisco Call of September 11th, 1898. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we'll see you next time on Americana Archives.